Hello again. Welcome back to the third portion of the spinal cord. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about the distribution of spinal nerves. Remember, when the anterior and posterior root join, that's the spinal nerve. Once they join, they immediately are going to start splitting. They're going to start splitting into different structures, which include the posterior ramus. So ramus is a branch off the spinal nerve, and it's going to innervate your back, muscles of your back, and innervate the skin. The anterior ramus will go on and innervate the various limbs of the body. The anterior ramus will split and interweave with the branches of other anterior rami, and it's going to make a big, complicated kind of rat nest of cables, and those are called plexuses. Plexuses. So, in the picture, we can see the posterior root and the anterior root fuse to form the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve is just this portion right here. The first branch we have innervating the back is going to be the posterior ramus. This portion here, which almost half the class usually calls the spinal nerve, but it's not the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve is just right here. Spinal nerve, anterior ramus. The anterior ramus is going to branch and interweave with the branches of other anterior rami from other spinal nerves to make a big, complicated spaghetti mess of nerves called a plexus. And then outside of those plexuses, we have the named nerves of the body: phrenic nerve, brachial nerve, sciatic nerve, those kinds of things. So you should conceptualize in your brain, you have your spinal cord, one step laterally, the beginning of the peripheral nervous system. Rootlets, one step to roots, one step to spinal nerve. From the spinal nerve, you're going to branch into the posterior ramus, the anterior ramus, and the ramicomunicatans, which I'll talk about in a second. So posterior, anterior ramus, ramicomunicatans. The anterior ramus continues on to form plexuses. Lateral to the plexuses, you have the named nerves of the body: sciatic, phrenic, that kind of thing. So this guy here, the ramicomunicatans, is going to form an important part, of the autonomic nervous system. So if we have time, we'll cover the autonomic nervous system next time. So this sympathetic trunk ganglion has something to do with the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so as a review, we have the spinal cord proper, CNS, central nervous system. One step away from that, rootlets, we have now entered the peripheral nervous system. Rootlets join to roots. Here we have the posterior root ganglion, the posterior root and the anterior root fuse to form the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve immediately ends and branches into the ramicomunicatans, the posterior ramus, and then on to the anterior ramus. The anterior ramus will branch and it will intermingle with the branches of other anterior rami to form a plexus. On the far side of the plexuses, nerves of the body. Okay. Another topic I want to talk about is a dermatome. So a dermatome is a particular area of the skin that is innervated by a particular spinal nerve. So all the spinal nerves of the body are going to innervate the skin. They're going to go to the skin except for the cervical nerve number 1. C1 does not reach the skin. All other spinal nerves will reach the skin. So a dermatome is a map showing the areas on the surface of the skin that are innervated by a particular spinal nerves. So you notice it's going to start with C2, C3. There's no C1, right? The trigeminal nerve, one of the cranial nerves, that is going to help innervate much of the face, but you notice there's no C1 here on the face. C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, C8. Kind of makes sense. The cervical region, this is all sort of the cervical area of the body. Thoracic region is all the thoracic region of the body. You notice things start to get a little bit strange here. We don't have this nice striped banding pattern. We get these stripes of the lumbar region kind of being on the lateral surfaces of the leg and the sacral region, the back of the legs and the back side. And we get this weird stripe pattern in the arms. It all looks very strange. It's a very odd pattern here. There is some sense to it, but I'll get to that in a second. So what is a dermatome? What I want you to understand is a dermatome is a particular region of the skin that is innervated by a particular spinal nerve. And the value of this, it will help you determine the location of damage to your spinal cord. If you get into a car accident and your back is broken, right, the doctor might want to know, where are you injured, right? So she could take a little pencil and start poking you. Can you feel this? Can you feel this? Can you feel this? Right? Doctor will know this map and know that if you poke somebody in the hip and they can feel it, but you poke them on the lateral side of their thigh and they cannot feel it, that tells you that there is damage to the spinal cord in between L1 and L2. Right? You wouldn't normally think about that in your hip region having damage to your lumbar spine, which is in a slightly different area, because the map of the patch of skin that's innervated does not directly overlay to that exact area of the body, right? Notice down here, the difference between your upper calf and the lateral side of your ankle, right? Very different regions. That's nowhere near your sacral region, but those areas are serviced by spinal nerves in your sacral or lumbar region. Now, if you look at the dermatome map in this position, because long time ago when we were quadrupeds, now all of a sudden this makes sense, right? You have your brain up here, your spinal cord out there, you're going to have nerves extending along the spinal cord. Now this map makes a whole lot of sense, right? Take something that we used to be quadrupeds, stand them up straight, and then you get a map that doesn't really make any sense. But remember where this evolved from, where this came from when we were quadrupeds. Anyway, I don't expect you to memorize that. I don't expect you to memorize the various demarcations of the various areas of the dermatome, right? If you want to be an orthopedist or back surgeon or something like that, it's useful information to know. But what I do want you to know, what is a dermatome? It's an area of skin that's innervated by a particular spinal nerve. Why is it relevant? Because it can help you determine where an injury to the spinal cord has occurred. Right. So the dermatome map can be important because anesthesia, loss of feeling, can help you locate damage. Also, dermatomes are involved in referred visceral pain. So we'll talk about referred visceral pain a little bit later in the class, but what I'll simply explain here, you can have cross-circuiting between the visceral sensory nervous system and the somatic sensory nervous system. So a dermatome should be serviced by your somatic sensory nervous system, right? Carrying information of areas of your body you're consciously aware of, right? If you have damage in an organ and those two systems are cross-circuited, you will feel pain in the surface of your skin that is not originating from damage of your skin. It's originating from damage in an organ. But because those two pathways are intermingled, you will perceive it as pain in your skin, right? So the classical example of that is people grabbing their left arm or their left shoulder when they're having a heart attack. Has their arm been damaged? No. But does their arm hurt? Yes. Where is that coming from? It's actually pain sensors in the heart being fired. But we very rarely need to use that pathway. Most of us have no conscious sensation of our heart. We don't really feel it, the heart itself beating inside our chest, right? You may feel your chest wall moving because of your heart, but you don't normally feel things with your heart. That pathway is very rarely used, and it intermingles with the dermatome in your left arm. So pain receptors fired in your heart, you will consciously perceive them as pain in the dermatome of your skin of your left arm, because these pathways share a common portion there. They circuit each other. So we'll talk a little more about referred visceral pain later. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about nerve plexuses. Remember, anterior rami branch, they then interweave with the branches of other anterior rami to form plexuses. So a nerve plexus is a network of interweaving anterior rami of spinal nerves. Just what I said, just a little fancier language. Right? The anterior rami of most spinal nerves form plexuses. So forming the plexus is the norm. There are some exceptions, particularly in the thoracic region. So there are no thoracic plexuses. You do get them elsewhere, but I'll show you an example of this. Right. Plexus is split into multiple named nerves of the body: phrenic, sciatic, brachial nerves. Major plexuses include cervical, somewhere in the neck, brachial, having to do with your arms, lumbar, and sacral. Sometimes some groups will combine lumbar and sacral into the lumbosacral plexus. Okay, we're going to start with the weird ones. We're going to start with the intercostal nerves. No plexuses in your thoracic region. Here, you're going to have rootlets joining to form a spinal nerve. The spinal nerve forms the rami communicatus, the posterior ramus, and the anterior ramus just goes in between the ribs. So they're called intercostal nerves. No plexus. Let's look at the picture. Here we can see the roots to the spinal nerve, the posterior ramus, to the rami communicatus, and look, no branching of the anterior ramus. The anterior ramus simply runs in between the ribs. That's why they're called intercostal nerves. So this is the exception. No plexuses in your thoracic region. Now let's look at plexuses. So the cervical plexus is formed from the anterior rami of C1 through C4. Right? Innervates the anterior muscles of the neck and shoulders. Out of this plexus, you will form the phrenic nerve. Right? Phrenic nerve is super important because this is what controls your diaphragm. Right? You sever your phrenic nerve, your diaphragm is paralyzed and you're going to suffocate. So, do you need to memorize all the detailed information here? Not for this class, right? You want to go to medical school or something like that? Yeah. So here, anterior ramus of C1, C2, C3, C4. Notice these things in blue are other nerves that also get drawn into or have some attachment to the plexus. So these guys in blue here, a hypoglossal nerve and accessory nerve, these are cranial nerves, but they're going to participate in this plexus, right? So what do we need to remember, right? This is cervical vertebra number 1. So the spinal nerve number 1 comes out on top of it, and spinal nerve number 2 comes out beneath it. Okay, so this is an anterior ramus, right? So spinal anterior, posterior root joined together to form the spinal nerve, then branches into the posterior ramus, rami communicatus, and the anterior ramus. Here's your anterior ramus. Anterior ramus then branches and interweaves with the branches of other anterior ramus, 1, 2, 3, 4, to make a big old spaghetti mess. This is the plexus. And then out of the plexus, you get named nerves of the body. Supraclavicular nerve, 3 guesses where that goes. The phrenic nerve, that one I do want you to know because it controls the diaphragm. Okay, don't need to know exactly what each one of these things are. I do want you to know, I want you to be able to identify the cervical plexus. You see a big old rat nest of nerves that's in the neck? Cervical plexus. All right, moving on, brachial plexus, this is a big one. Right and left brachial plexuses form a network of nerves that are going to innervate your arms. Brachial plexus are formed from the spinal nerves of C5 through T1. Right? So C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. Anterior rami are going to branch and interweave to form a plexus. Out of that, we're going to get the median nerve, the axillary nerve, the radial nerve, the ulnar nerve, right? So if you know your regions and you know the bones in the body, you know where these nerves go. So I'm not going to test you on it, but right, you can think your way through this and you already know a lot of neuroanatomy without having to do any extra work. Lumbar plexus. So remember, cervical, got that. Brachial, got that. Skip the chest. No thoracic plexus. Going down to our next region of the vertebral column, we're going to hit the lumbar. So lumbar plexus, made from L1 through L5. Right. Femoral nerve. Sacral plexus, this is the big one. Right. So the sacral plexus, L4 through S4. Here, L4 through S4, we get a big plexus and we're going to get a really big nerve, right? The sciatic nerve, right? Your sciatic nerve is going to go through that greater sciatic notch. Anyway, again, don't need to memorize all the particulars of this information or of these nerves, but I want you to be able to identify it, right? L4 through S4, sacral plexus. All right. Almost done. Let's talk about our last subject matter, which is reflexes. So a reflex are rapid, so they're fast, automatic, you don't have to think about them, involuntary, you don't have any control over them, reactions of muscles, glands to some particular kind of stimulus. So stimulus means you're going to involve a receptor, afferent nervous system. If you're going to have some sort of response by a muscle or gland, you're going to have a component of the motor nervous system, the efferent motor system. A stimulus is required to begin the response. A rapid response requires, or I should say that the fewer neurons you have in a reflex, the faster it will occur. The reason this is action potentials are fast. Action potentials travel on axons super quickly, especially if they're myelinated. Jump, 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 jump. They go really, really quick. Synapses are slow. Chemical synapses are very, very slow. So when you're trying to get information from one part of the body to the other, all the distances of the axons are traveled, relatively instantaneously. But anytime you have a synapse, you're going to have to, the action potential causes channels to open, which leads to the synaptic vesicles fusing with the plasma membrane, the release of the neurotransmitter that diffuses across the synapse, bind a receptor, which generates another action potential, which travels down the second neuron. Right? That's a lot of stuff going on. And it's all having to do movement with molecules. That's really slow. So the more synapses you have, the more neurons you have, the slower the response. However, there's a cost-benefit thing here. The more neurons you have, the more synapses you have, the slower the reflex, but the more complicated and more sophisticated the response can be. The fewer neurons you have, the less precise control, the less sophistication you get in the response, but the faster it goes. So this is all hardwired, usually at the level of the spinal cord or brain stem. Right? And when you trigger reflex, it's going to happen the same every single time because it's an automatic, rapid, involuntary response to some sort of stimulus. Right? You don't need to be pre-aware, right, to generate the activity. So the actual circuitry of the neurons involved is called a reflexive arc. Reflexive arc must begin at a receptor. Right? Receptors could be just free nerve endings, have to be out or connected to the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, this ties back into our very first chapter, the peripheral nervous system, its dendrites are going to be connected to a receptor. Its axons have to project into the central nervous system, brain or spinal cord. There, it's going to have to interact with, at a minimum, one motor neuron in the central nervous system. The cell body of that motor neuron has to be in the central nervous system, and its axon travels out of the CNS, down the PNS to some sort of effector. So, receptor, sensory neuron, its axon enters the central nervous system, where it will have a synapse with a motor neuron. The axon of the motor neuron will then leave the central nervous system, travel back down the peripheral nervous system to a particular effector. So the example here, boink, needle goes into the skin. We're going to activate a nociceptor, which is a pain receptor. That will generate an action potential, which travels down the dendrite, right? This will be along the nerve that, say, innervates the arm. Right? Once it gets to the level of the spinal nerve, the sensory information will separate from the motor information. Right? We'll pass through the posterior root ganglion. We'll find the soma of this somatic sensory neuron, because this is information that we're consciously aware of because we got stuck by a pin. Right? That action potential travels down the axon, where in this case, it will have a synapse with an interneuron. This interneuron, will interface in between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. It has two collaterals. One collateral will then synapse on a motor neuron, in this case, in the anterior gray horn, where you find the cell bodies of somatic motor neurons, which control skeletal muscle, right? The axon of that somatic motor neuron then travels down the anterior root, which carries efferent motor information, to join up with the spinal nerve to eventually pass through the anterior ramus, through a plexus, the brachial plexus, down to the nerve that controls the biceps brachii, right? And then activate the biceps brachii gets short, flexes your antebrachium, and pulls your hand out of danger. Now, what's going on with this second axon collateral of the interneuron? Well, it's going to ascend the funiculus, and it will then have a synapse in your thalamus. From your thalamus, you're going to have another neuron which will travel to your primary somatosensory cortex, thinking of that homunculus, and it's going to activate another neuron in an area of the body that's dedicated to sensing pain in your finger or your skin or wherever the needle got poked. So I've kind of laid it on kind of thick with the detail. Let's break it down a little bit more clearly. We're starting with a stimulus, some interaction with the outside world, a pin stick. This triggers a pain receptor, or a nociceptor. The nociceptor generates an action potential down a sensory neuron. This carries afferent information towards the central nervous system, in this case, the spinal cord. Here we're going to have a chemical synapse with an interneuron. The interneuron is activated. It sends an action potential down one collateral, and then the other. One goes up to the brain, so you become consciously aware of what's happened. However, that's a long way away. You get stuck, sensory information comes to the central nervous system. The central nervous system, your spinal cord, now makes a decision without conscious thought, activates a motor neuron. The efferent information travels out the anterior root to the spinal nerve. It eventually is going to trigger an effector, in this case, skeletal muscle. So the information needs to go from your skin to your spinal cord, and then back from your spinal cord to the effector to pull it out of danger. Right? And this is why reflexes are fast. It doesn't need to travel and then bounce around 5 different centers of your brain until it gets to your higher order cognitive function, until you're consciously aware of what's going on, right? You touch a hot plate, your arm is pulling back before it starts to hurt, because your spinal cord has already made the decision, this is bad, get the hand out of the way. And then you're like, oh, then the pain hits, because it takes that long for the information to travel through the various other synapses that is going to have to go from the interneuron to the thalamus, and the thalamus, the primary somatosensory cortex, and to wherever else it needs to go, Gnostic area, Wernicke's area, before you start understanding what's really going on. So the fewer the neurons, the faster a reflex can occur. However, the less sophistication you can get in your response. This particular one, pin in the finger, hot stove, I think everyone's familiar with, but there are many kinds of reflexes. Reflexes that control breathing, reflexes that control the function of the eye. There's a couple fun ones that I'll talk to you guys about in Zoom. But that's it. for spinal cord. That brings us to the end of the section. I've included some study materials for you guys to check out. Let me know if you have any questions. See you soon. Till then, take care.